Hey, quick favor, we need your input. For a few weeks this August, we are going to be giving ourselves our usual late summer break, and as usual, we'll be running some favorites from the archives. But this year, we are asking for your help in deciding what to run. In our newsletter, we're going to be doing a series of votes on what episode we should feature each day. So it's up to you to chime in, and that will help us decide. All you have to do is subscribe to the This Day newsletter at thisdaypod.com. We'll be sending out our first poll soon, so jump on it. From fitness routines to mental resilience, navigating personal goals to tackling burnout, we could all use a little help being human. And that is what the Life Kit podcast from NPR is here to do. As I'm sure you've noticed, life does not come with a manual, but you still have to make choices every day, some big, some small, and these shape the direction of your life. Well, Life Kit delivers strategies to help you make meaningful, sustainable change. I personally am still in summer mode over here, and lately Life Kit has been really delivering with advice on how to improve your grilling or make a salad for your next picnic, how to beat the heat on a humid day. Ice towels, people, ice towels, they really make a huge difference. But of course, even when you are in summer mode, life still presents much thornier issues, and Life Kit has recently done episodes on preparing your home for possible flooding, staying out of credit card debt, making hard decisions together with your spouse. I promise, if you go to the Life Kit feed and take a scroll through the topics, you will find something that will help with a dilemma in your life. So go ahead and check it out. Listen now to the Life Kit podcast from NPR. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, August 1944, it's the height of the Second World War. Many of you listening are aware that on the west coast of the United States, this country set up internment camps where Japanese Americans were forced to live in the latter years of the war. We've done a number of episodes on those camps. But let's go instead to Texas, to a smaller set of camps and a really fascinating, heartbreaking, and I would say largely forgotten story about another set of camps. In these camps, people of Japanese, German, and Italian descent were rounded up and put behind barbed wire. But the wrinkle is that these people were from other countries, from Latin American countries, who were deported to the United States to be put in these camps. That's right. Latin Americans deported to Texas and put in camps. Let's talk about the program that brought these folks here, some 5,000 or 6,000 of them, and what life was like inside one of the camps. The most notable was a place called Crystal City. Here, as always, to discuss, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We collectively know a lot about U.S. history, but every once in a while we should just admit that we find a story that is just like, whoa, I had no idea.
I mean, this is something I've written about, something I've taught about, Japanese internment, and I've never come across this story before, which is on me, but like it is definitely not a well-known story.
Yeah.
No, not at all. And I don't think most Americans would be aware of the fact that they were interning not just Japanese, but Germans and Jews, and the extent of it, the length of it, and all that we're going to dive into is it's incredible.
And just the simple fact that, obviously their historical resonance is there about deporting people to other countries for them to put them into camps. And we did the opposite of that in the 40s. So before we get to kind of an understanding of what life was like inside this camp, Crystal City, let's lay the groundwork for kind of the policy that led to this. Niki, I mean, is it the same policy that led to the Japanese internment camps on the West Coast? And what are the mechanisms here?
It's the same purpose in a sense, but it's actually a parallel and completely distinct policy track that it develops on. So listeners may know that in February of 1942, Franklin Roosevelt authorizes the removal of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans from the West Coast. They're put into the camps that most Americans know a lot about. 120,000 Japanese immigrants and Americans are put into these camps. A month before that, so in January of 1942, the U.S. enters negotiations with a variety of different Latin American countries. And in those negotiations, the U.S. pushes for the deportation of Axis nationals, let's call it that, like people who are from countries or whose parents were from countries that are on the Axis side in World War II. And during these negotiations, the Latin American delegation, some of them, we'll talk about the exceptions, agreed to expel, quote, dangerous Axis aliens. And they also couple this with a policy of, well, we're going to slow down naturalization so people from Axis countries can't become citizens. And we're also, maybe if we think that somebody empathizes or sympathizes or supports the Axis powers, we'll just strip them of their citizenship.
Yeah. There is I want to get to some of the motivations for this. I mean, obviously one of them is just xenophobia, right? And you look at some of this language and it's basically, anyone of German descent, anyone of Japanese descent is considered dangerous, which is obviously misguided, racist, xenophobic. But is there also like a national security idea here that, how is it Latin America specifically implicated in all of this?
So you've got to go back to something called the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
We've talked a lot about how the U.S. meddles in Latin America. They see that as part of their purview as the big power in the Western Hemisphere. And so the U.S. takes a strong hand in Latin America, and they frame this as a security issue, right? That there's going to potentially be an invasion by Japan or by Germany of Latin America, and that Japanese or German or Axis forces in general are going to push up through Mexico and come up across the southern border with the United States. The Zimmerman telegram from World War I had this idea that Mexico would side with Germany and that they would take over the United States that way. So that's kind of what the fear is based on. So that's the security concern, along with things like you've got the Panama Canal there. You have all of these U.S. corporations in all of these Latin American countries. So it is about safeguarding U.S. national security and economic interests in Latin America. So that is definitely a part of it.
Right.
And I don't think people are also aware of just the large number of Japanese people that are living in Latin America. I mean, Brazil is like, at the time, over 250,000 Japanese are living in Brazil. You have about 26,000 Japanese living in Peru. Like, these are large communities that are able to sort of like come to Latin America, bring their families, find work, and they're all being displaced. And targeted.
I'll just say, I grew up in Latin America. I've traveled in South America a lot, and just the sort of the long legacy of Asian immigrants in Latin American countries is really fascinating.
And that too shaped by U.S. policy, right? Yeah. U.S. Starting in the early 20th century stopped allowing Japanese immigration, and so Japanese immigrants who were trying to come to the Western Hemisphere would have to go to some of these different countries. I think that's a really important piece of understanding which Latin American countries participate in this. Part of the story of internment in the United States was white Californians saw Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans as an economic threat, right? That they were filling jobs and filling roles that those white Americans wanted. They had property that white Americans wanted. And in some of these Latin American countries, there was a real desire to expel Japanese Latin Americans because of this economic competition, along with the racism and xenophobia you've talked about.
Right. Well, and we'll continue to see that play out, and obviously, just the way that this just skews all of the rationale and just leads to just kind of on its face absurd thinking is evident throughout this story. And but just to put a fine point on it, I mean, the idea that Germany and Japan decide to invade the U.S. through Latin America, and these thousands of people of Japanese descent, who many of whom have been living in Latin America for, many generations and feel more Chilean than they do Japanese in many ways, that they're like sleeper agents who are then all of a sudden going to get activated and help the Axis mount a land invasion. I mean, you can see the kind of absurdity of the thinking.
Yeah, it's more of a movie than a reality.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
But very much a part of the propaganda of the era, right?
Yes.
I'm sure a lot of listeners have seen the Dr. Seuss cartoons, propaganda cartoons from this era, and it had exactly that fifth column idea that they were just waiting for directions from Japan.
And we've talked about in World War I how there was real kind of suspicion of anyone of German descent that they would all of a sudden just, when forced to pick a side, would take up arms. But okay, so yes, you pointed out that Chile and Argentina don't participate in this. Peru is the one that really enters into an agreement with the U.S. Eventually, 1,800 Japanese Peruvians in total are sent to the United States. Anything else to say before we kind of get a sense of what life is like at Crystal City internment camp?
Peru leads the way, but there's about a dozen other Latin American countries that are also participating. Guatemala, Costa Rica, Brazil, they're all a part of this as well.
Yeah.
And we're focusing on Japanese Latin Americans. But of course, there were, as we've mentioned, German and Italian Latin Americans who were also repatriated or who were expelled or sent to detention camps. That includes about 4,000 ethnic Germans, a couple hundred ethnic Italians. And Crystal City, which we'll talk about in a second, it was set up for deported Japanese Latin Americans, but it actually opens to German Latin Americans who were the first group to arrive there.
Yeah. Yeah. There are 5 Panamanian Germans who had been in Nazi concentration camps who end up in one of these camps, which is just the kind of perversion of that. It's just wild. All right. So, Kellie, what do we need to know about Crystal City? What's life like inside this camp?
Crystal City is about 110 miles southwest of San Antonio. It is a small rural town, which is kind of the reason why they picked it. It was a town during the Great Depression that they used to support spinach farming, had a lot of the infrastructure that was sort of already set up there. And so when you think of these large groups of deportees, they're coming through Panama, getting processed in New Orleans, and then from there being put on trains and brought to West Texas. And then they're set up in these camps that look like a town, a small town, if you will. There's schools, there's small houses, there are grocery stores. If you were to just sort of like give a peripheral view, you might think, okay, this is just sort of a regular town, until you looked at the barbed wire all around. You saw sort of the towers and the guardsmen and people with guns, and it made it very clear that you were constantly under surveillance. And for a while, they had sort of separated the men from the women, but as people start to come with their families, and there's lots of children there as well. The children are attending school there. The parents are finding jobs or things to work while they're there. But a lot of them are showing up particularly sick. Whooping cough is going on. There's a measles outbreak. There is this disease called impetigo, which I had not heard of, but it's a bacteria, a skin infection that can spread very easily, highly contagious. So they're not particularly well cared for. And even if you were to say, well, these are not terrible conditions, it's not a prison. No, there's constant surveillance and you don't have any control over your life. And you're there and you're not sure how long you're going to be there. And that's what's really depressing about the entire situation, is that you have no autonomy and you are sort of in limbo in terms of like citizenship, your identity, your nationality, because you can't necessarily go back to Japan if you're not really from there. And it's kind of hostile to go back to Latin America as well.
Communication is critical to your success in your personal and professional life. I'm Matt Abrahams, and I teach strategic communication at Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I host Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast. I sit down with experts to discuss actionable advice that you can immediately apply to your life. We cover topics like managing communication anxiety, speaking better in the moment, maximizing your influence, and how to negotiate to get what you want and need. Listen wherever you get your podcasts to level up your communication.
As summer winds down, I'm all about refreshing my wardrobe with staple pieces for the season ahead. And Quince nails it with luxe essentials that feel effortless and look polished, perfect for layering and mixing. I recently went and picked out a couple pairs of slacks, a light jacket, because you know that crisp fall air will be here before we know it. And then I was looking around the Quince website and I noticed a section I hadn't seen before: kids. I'm not sure if this applies to you, but oh my gosh, my kid is going back to school soon. And not only that, they grew over the summer. That always kind of sneaks up on me. Well, luckily, Quince has stylish and affordable kids' clothes, so I quickly snagged a linen overshirt, a pair of kids' jeans, and even some new running pants. They also have kids' backpacks, by the way, just a tip. So, whether for you or whoever, elevate your fall wardrobe essentials with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
I think I would just put a line under that point that, yes, there are like Boy and Girl Scout camps, and there are plays and picnics and all of these different kinds of things. But there's also constant surveillance. There's a head count every morning. Your letters are censored. Like, you were constantly under surveillance in a country you never chose to go to, that you have been deported to with no idea of what the future holds for you. And I think that's key to understanding kind of the lived experience of all of the internees.
What I also find interesting, too, is that a lot of these children especially spoke Spanish. That was their native language. And they're instructing them in German and in Japanese and in languages that they may not have spoken at home. And so they're also sort of being indoctrinated into these identities that might feel foreign to them.
Yeah. So these camps, which, you know, and I'm kind of trying to think of like the parallel. It's almost like a sharecropping or like a company town, you know, where we've talked about where, like, there's money, but you can only be used at the camp. You know, there's activities, but it's really there to keep people working and concentrated. And so, you know, that's a really fascinating kind of ecosystem. Let's talk a little bit about how long it lasts, how it starts to wind down. I mean, it's like a lot of the Japanese internment camps. It's about a year or two of this era here. And eventually, you know, in September 1945, as the war is winding down, Truman issues a presidential proclamation that authorizes the removal of enemy aliens who are, quote, within the territory of the United States without admission under the immigration laws, which is, in plain language, to say, okay, we're going to let you out, and the moment we let you out, you are an illegal alien in this country, and then we're going to deport you.
This drives me nuts. I mean, this is what's happened actually right now with migrants who have temporary protected status, have that status stripped from them, and suddenly they're in the country unlawfully, and you're just like, but they came here lawfully, and in this case, they were dragged here by the United States government.
Yes.
Against their will, and now they're put again into this kind of legal limbo and subject to deportation, but not necessarily deportation back to the place where they lived.
Yeah, you're not going back to Peru. You might be going back. Well, I can't say back. You might be going to Japan, or you might be going to, a country that's been war-torn, and you have to sort of figure out how you're going to navigate that space.
And that's in part because the other countries that were playing ball in this, for instance, Peru, had cracked down on immigration and were not allowing people of Japanese descent to come back into their country. And so now these people are in limbo and, often end up back in a country that they don't really have a connection to, or in another country that they don't really have a connection to. The camp closes in 1948, about 2 years after it had opened, 2 years after the end of the war. It is the last of all these facilities that were housing so-called enemy aliens to close up. What else? And what's the legacy of this, as we can best tell?
Well, you talked about this kind of limbo that had been created. So there are, at the time the camps closed, 300 Japanese Peruvians who had nowhere to go. And the U.S. was finally just like, fine, you can stay. They make them permanent, legally admitted immigrants. A lot of them actually go to New Jersey, where they work as severely underpaid farm laborers. So there's a community there that seems pretty fascinating. And then a number of them do what a lot of immigrants who are kind of not granted full citizenship or who are conditional citizens do, and they joined the military. And they would fight for the U.S. in places like Korea in the years that followed.
There's no real restitution for that time that was lost. I mean, later we talk about, reparations to Japanese in internment camps, and there is some of that. But for a lot of these people, there's no money, there's no check, there's no, and if there is, it's very little. And, in 1998, they award 145 people about $5,000 each, which is not a lot of money at all. And, an apology. But it means very little in the grand scheme of things when you compare it to how much was lost.
It also is like we've done an episode, I think, on the reparations that were paid to Japanese American internees. Yeah. And these folks at Crystal City were specifically left out because they were not U.S. citizens or permanent residents. And it's like, you're the ones that
caused the problem.
That would have been impossible. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, to illustrate that, I mean, in the 80s is when I think a lot of the conversation and reckoning, and there were a bunch of commissions about Japanese internment. That conversation starts to really bubble up, and there are some real efforts to at least reckon with what happened. And in the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians final report, that mostly looks at West Coast internment, this group that we're talking about here is literally in like an appendix, of that report. And so it goes to show you how this has just always remained a kind of secondary story or a little add-on and has never gotten its full due in terms of acknowledgement and reparations.
I think it's also worth mentioning, because we did an episode on Fred Korematsu, that listeners will recall that in 1944, the Supreme Court sanctioned Japanese internment. And it should have been a dead issue. This was considered part of the anti-canon, right? It's not good law. It's bad law from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court finally officially overturned, I think, just a few years ago. But Korematsu in spirit is extremely alive and well today. The current Supreme Court majority is operating under the logic of Korematsu when it comes to detention, deportation. And I think folding this story in gives us a sort of richer and fuller understanding of the kind of legacy of Korematsu and internment that goes even further beyond the Japanese Americans and immigrants who were interned here.
Yeah. And, as horrific and evil as a story like this is, I also just keep thinking about something, Kellie, you've said a number of times on the show, which is just like the logic of racism and xenophobia puts you in just such absurd situations, right? And so just to think that this country at one point deported people to this country in order to then, intern them because the logic of anti-Asian xenophobia kind of justified that is just kind of remarkable. And we see people twisting themselves into absurd knots now around many of these same impulses.
Yeah, it's an irrational fear. Yeah,
exactly. All right. Well, I'm really glad we got to this. We are kind of learning about this alongside you, listeners, but I'm really glad we got to this story. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.